On the 31st of October 1917, during the First World War, 800 Australian horsemen charged against Turkish machine guns. Using their bayonets as swords, it was the culminating action in the Allied victory at the Battle of Beersheba, and was depicted in the film The Lighthorsemen. You might have heard of Lawrence of Arabia, but what do you know about the wider Sinai-Palestine Campaign in the Middle East during the First World War? Away from the Arab Revolt, this theatre saw over 1 million troops from the British and Ottoman Empires, with a few from France, fighting each other in the deserts of Egypt and the Levant, resulting in nearly 250,000 casualties, including over 40,000 dead. The campaign started with the British Empire forces initially defending the Suez Canal against attacks from the Turkish Ottoman Empire. But by 1917, the Ottoman forces had been pushed back from the canal through the Sinai and were now holding a defensive line from Gaza on the Mediterranean coast across the desert to Beersheba, about 46 kilometres to the southeast. The British commanded army, the Egyptian Expeditionary Force, had already tried to break through at Gaza twice before that year, and both battles had ended in defeat. Now the new commander of the EEF, General Sir Edmund Allenby, decided on a different approach. Rather than taking on the Turkish defences where they were strongest, he would turn the flank at the far end of their defensive line, at Beersheba. And unlike Gaza, Beersheba, sitting at the foot of the Judean hills, was defended by a much smaller garrison of only about 4,000 men. The challenge was that the approach to Beersheba was through the Negev desert. With almost no water supplies for men or horses, it presented a natural barrier to add to the machine guns of the Turks. That waterless approach to the end of their line made the Turks confident that no one would be mad enough to attack through the desert. But one man was. Lieutenant General Sir Philip Chetwode, the commander of the 20th Corps, was convinced that it could be done. Educated at Eton, the 48-year-old was commissioned in the army in 1889 and had served throughout the Boer War in South Africa. Using records of the Palestine Exploration Fund and the knowledge of local Bedouins, he correctly guessed that there were potential water supplies at Azluj, 30 miles south of Beersheba. With this vital supply of water, he devised a plan to secretly move his own 20th Infantry Corps and the Desert Mounted Corps and launch a surprise attack on Beersheba. Due to the shortages of water in the desert at this end of the Ottomans' defensive line, it was vital that his force capture the 17 wells at Beersheba intact. And this meant that any attack needed to be swift so as to prevent the Turks destroying the wells. Because if they did so, it was game over. Chetwode's force would have to withdraw back across the desert. The plan was to attack the town with infantry from the southwest, whilst mounted troops from the Desert Mounted Corps would attack from the east. The Desert Mounted Corps consisted of the Anzac Mounted Division of Australian and New Zealanders, the Australian Mounted Division, formerly called the Imperial Mounted Division, and the Imperial Camel Corps Brigade. It was commanded by Lieutenant General Sir Harry Chevelle. The 52-year-old Chevelle had served in the Queensland Mounted Infantry during the Boer War. At the outbreak of the First World War, he was promoted to the rank of colonel and was made temporary Major General during the Gallipoli campaign. Using deception to convince the Turks and their German allies that the attack would once more focus on Gaza, Allenby then secretly moved 40,000 men, including most of Chetwode's 20 Corps and Chevelle's Desert Mounted Corps, eastwards into the desert. The final advance was a night march of over 20 miles on the 30th of October. The men of the Australian 12th Light Horse Regiment actually dismounted their horses and walked 10 miles to rest their mounts in the desert. On the morning of the 31st of October 1917, 3 British infantry divisions attacked Beersheba from the west and south, supported by over 100 guns. The men of the 60th London and 74th Yeomanry Divisions drove the Turks back, but the town and its wells remained in Turkish hands. At 9 a.m, the Anzac Mounted Division was ordered to close the Beersheba to Makati Road, northeast of the town, to prevent flight or indeed reinforcements arriving from Jerusalem. However, they met stronger than expected resistance from a redoubt at Tel El Saba, and it took until mid-afternoon to finally take the position. And still, Beersheba and its wells remained uncaptured. It was now at 4 p.m. that the 4th Australian Light Horse Brigade were ordered to attack the eastern defences of the town. It was a charge that would go down in history. Commanded by Brigadier General William Grant, a son of the state of Victoria, the 4th Light Horse Brigade reformed in January 1917, and along with the 3rd Australian Light Horse Brigade and the 5th and 6th British Mounted Brigades, had formed the Imperial Mounted Division, which by the time of the battle had been renamed the Australian Mounted Division. Grant's 4th Light Horse Brigade consisted of the 4th Light Horse Regiment, mainly recruited from the state of Victoria, the 12th Light Horse Regiment, drawn mainly from New South Wales, and the 11th. The 4th and 12th would lead the charge, whilst the 11th would ride behind in reserve. Each regiment was divided into 3 squadrons of around 128 men each, and these squadrons were set up between 300 and 400 metres apart to allow them to spread out as they charged. General Grant personally addressed the men of the 12th Light Horse Regiment, telling them they had to capture the wells that afternoon. He finished his address with the simple words, "I wish you the best of luck." And then the 4th Australian Light Horse Brigade started to trot towards the Turkish positions 4 miles away. Horses against machine guns. It was unconventional, but so was their weapon of choice. The light horse, as their name implies, were armed with rifles. In other words, they were more like mounted infantry than traditional cavalry. Indeed, in all their actions to date, they had tended to dismount and use their rifles to tackle their enemies, both here in the Sinai Campaign and also previously at Gallipoli. But Grant's orders, all the way from Allenby at the top, were to take the wells on this opening day. Time was running out, and therefore speed was imperative. He ordered his men to sweep in like cavalry, with their rifles slung over their backs, using their bayonet points, which had been deliberately sharpened, like swords. It was unconventional, but sometimes unconventional takes your enemy by surprise. As they crested a small hill about 4 miles from the Turkish trenches, they increased speed. German and Turkish commanders had never believed that the light horse would be so foolhardy as to charge their lines, and their men were totally unprepared for what was about to happen. As the Australians broke into a gallop, they suddenly realised they were facing a cavalry charge. Desperately, the German and Turkish commanders tried to recalibrate their men's weapons for close-range battle. Finally, at less than 2 miles, they opened fire. The Australians galloped forward into a hail of shrapnel, bullets and machine gun fire. Fortunately, because they had deliberately charged spread out, that fire was not as devastating as their enemy intended. It also helped that the British Notts and Essex artillery batteries, who were acting in support, now turned their fire on the Turkish machine gun nests. At that very moment, German aircraft swept low overhead, with the pilots dropping bombs onto the Australians below. But they couldn't stop the charge. Queenslander trooper Thomas O'Leary of the 4th Light Horse was the first to arrive at the Turkish lines, and jumped his horse clean over the 4-foot wide trench. Others in that leading wave also sailed over the Turkish defences and continued their charge towards the town. On reaching Beersheba, O'Leary captured a gun and 30 Ottoman troops single-handed. He'd later be awarded the military medal. Meanwhile, the remainder of the 4th Light Horse Regiment dismounted and took on the Turks in hand-to-hand fighting, killing somewhere between 30 and 40 defenders, before the rest surrendered. Whilst that was going on, about 150 men of the 12th Light Horse Regiment rode through a gap between the trenches and a redoubt on the left-hand side of the charge. They now wheeled right and raced towards the town under Captain Roby. Roby and another officer, Captain Jack Davis, split their squadrons, moving through the streets, aiming to encircle the northern part of the town. The speed of the charge of the Australian Light Horse had caught the defenders by surprise, and they met little resistance, except for a stand by some soldiers near a railway viaduct at the north end of the town. Actually, and unbeknown to the Light Horse, the Turkish commander had already given orders for most of his troops to fall back. So when Roby and Davis rejoined their squadrons on the far side of the town, they now came face to face with the main Ottoman withdrawal column, complete with 9 guns in tow. After a tense standoff, the larger Ottoman force surrendered to them. Not only had the speed and ferocity of the Light Horse charge caught the defenders and that retreating column by surprise, but it had also prevented the Turks from destroying the wells, or indeed any of their other supplies, which now fell into the Allied hands. By 5:30 p.m, the town was firmly in Allied control, and as the evening wore on, the 11th Light Horse also entered the town, along with the British infantry advancing from the southwest. The Battle of Beersheba had been a resounding Allied victory. A victory made possible in no small part by the charge of the 4th Australian Light Horse Brigade. After the horrors of Gallipoli and the appalling losses of Anzac troops on the Western Front, the Australians now had a victory to savour. However, not all those young men had lived to tell the tale. In their charge at the Battle of Beersheba, 31 light horsemen were killed and a further 36 wounded. One of those killed was Australian Test cricketer Tibby Cotter, riding with the 4th Light Horse. Renowned as one of the fastest bowlers of his generation, earning him the nickname Terra Cotta from the English, he had played 21 times for his country prior to the war. Sadly, one of his brothers had already been killed serving with the Australian forces on the Western Front 3 weeks beforehand. At least 70 horses had also died in the charge. Whilst the battle culminated in that heroic charge by the Light Horse, it's worth remembering that both New Zealand and British troops had also spent a bloody day fighting in the battle. In fact, 171 British troops had been killed attacking the west and southwestern positions earlier that day. Including in that number was Captain John Fox Russell. The 24-year-old Welsh physician, who was a medical officer with the attacking Royal Welsh Fusiliers, had been awarded the Victoria Cross in the very first Battle of Gaza earlier that year. Meanwhile, the Ottoman forces had lost an estimated 1,000 men dead and wounded in the day's fighting, and a further 1,500 of their men had surrendered. The victory at Beersheba was a major turning point in the Allied campaign in the Middle East. Just a week later, Ottoman forces abandoned Gaza, and then, just before Christmas, General Allenby famously entered Jerusalem. One day shy from the first anniversary of the Battle of Beersheba, the Turks finally signed an armistice with the Allies. The losses suffered by the Light Horse at Beersheba are nothing in comparison to the 9,000 Australians who died at Gallipoli and the 46,000 who died on the Western Front. But there's something really stirring about their charge. And whilst there were other cavalry charges later on in this campaign, such as by the Warwickshire and Worcestershire Yeomanry at Hudge just a week later, it remains a standout moment in this campaign. On the 31st of October 1917, as the sun started to set across the desert, 800 young men charged 4 miles against machine guns, waving their bayonets. They captured a town mentioned in the Old Testament and turned the flank of their enemy. It's a story that is worth telling, on which Australians should feel justly proud. A special thanks to Patrick, Kent, Janet and Ben and all the rest of you whose support enables me to both research and produce my stories. And if you'd like to support my show in the future, then please click on the links in the description below. Thanks for joining me today. Keep well, and I'll see you again very soon.